Thank you, Your Honor. First question, very short and direct. Did you have a chance to view Investigator Heidel's Google Earth animation showing both recovery sites number 1 and 2 in Mark Redwine's home?
Yes.
Was it a fair and accurate representation of those areas?
Yes.
Judge, I'm objecting to this line of questioning. This is inconsistent that was made with the record that was made during the recess.
Well, not yet.
That's the only questions on the topic.
I mean, if it gone further, I would agree.
And then I just wanted to briefly publish the photographs that you found in the dumpster of Dylan Redwine. Exhibit 395. Is this one of the photographs that you found in the dumpster?
Yes.
Where was the dumpster located?
Off of County Road 223.
Is that in the Bayfield area?
Yes, between Bayfield, Durango.
And exhibit number 396. Also one of the photos you found in the dumpster?
Yes. Yes.
Thank you. No further questions.
All right, cross-examination.
Is it sergeant or deputy?
Deputy.
Deputy Golbricht, if you have difficulty understanding me or hearing me, let me or the judge know, and I'll adjust my tone and volume, okay?
Okay.
You testified yesterday about how you first got involved in this investigation. Remember talking about that?
Yes.
And you testified yesterday that you were first tasked in this investigation with meeting with the family of Dylan, correct?
Yes.
And that included meeting with Elaine and Corey, Elaine, then Redwine, now Hall, Corey Redwine, and Mike Hall.
Mike wasn't there the first meeting.
And you described on direct that you met with the family and you got to know them, you got to know what kind of kid Dylan was, correct?
Yes.
And at that point, you're in information acquisition mode, right?
Yes.
You're trying to get as much information about Dylan as you can, right?
Yes.
And you're having this being conveyed to you from the family of a missing child, right?
Yes.
And you also described that meeting as sort of debriefing the family about what was going on as well. You remember saying that yesterday?
I don't recall saying that, but yes, that was what we were doing.
Okay, so you're in information acquisition mode, and you're also trying to provide what information you can to the family of this missing child, right?
I was also very new to the case, so I was also gathering information and finding out what had been done on the case so far.
Right, and this was very, very early in the case, correct?
Yes.
So there, from your perspective, there was not a lot of information to convey.
Correct.
After you met with the family, then, as you described yesterday, you also met with the local friends of Dylan as well, correct?
Yes.
And again, you're in information acquisition mode, right?
Yes.
And you're trying to find out what Dylan's habits were, what activities he liked, correct?
Yes.
What he liked to do.
Yes.
And as you said yesterday, what kind of kid he was at that time, right?
Yes.
And so your first involvement in this case was not searching Middle Mountain, searching the reservoir, doing a neighborhood canvass, looking for clues, correct?
None of those things you listed. It was the other.
Your introduction to this case was meeting the people closest to Dylan.
Yes.
And that was your launching point. That was the first thing you did in this investigation. That was your launching point for this investigation, right?
Yes.
And safe to say, having these conversations with Dylan's family, that had an impact on you as an investigator looking into this case, correct?
An impact?
Yes.
Well, I suppose.
You suppose. And meeting with the kids who knew Dylan very well, that had an impact on you as an investigator as well.
I suppose.
And because you even said yesterday you didn't want to come into court at any point and not be able to say that you did everything you could to find Dylan, right?
Correct.
And that flows from the impact this case had on you, correct?
Yeah.
And the impact these conversations with family and friends had.
Yes.
And if the people are still plugged in, I'd turn your attention to the searches that you testified about on June 2013, and I'd respectfully ask the people to publish already admitted prosecution 227. And for the duration of this examination, I'd ask court's permission to move between here and the screen.
You may.
Thank you. You testified on direct that this was one of the search parties in June heading down from the gravel pit to what was later described as the dump site or recovery site, correct?
Yes.
And in this picture, search parties going downhill towards where a lot of the items you testified were found, correct?
Yes.
And one of the things you testified to on direct was a yellow road sign in the upper left-hand part of the photograph, correct?
Yes.
And you described that on direct as a yellow road sign that reflects light so people know that the road makes a serious turn, correct?
Yes.
So they don't drive off the road, right?
Yes.
And you would agree, driving up Middle Mountain Road, that's an obvious man-made landmark, correct?
Yes.
That's designed for motorists to see.
Yes.
That's designed to draw motorist attention to that part of the road, correct?
Yes.
I'd ask the people to publish 228, please. And you discussed on direct examination how this is kind of the area around and beneath, elevation-wise, where that yellow sign is, correct?
Correct.
And you described this area as heavily wooded, down trees, all that stuff, correct?
Yes.
And when you look at people's, and this is a fair and accurate representation of what that area looked like on the days these searches happened, correct?
Yes.
And can you describe for the jury what, if any, garbage or refuse you see in 228?
Can I look at the,
Whichever works best for you.
it's hard to say, but I don't see any in this picture.
Okay, moving on to People's 229, please. This was another picture of the search party, and I think it got described, I didn't write it down, is it a vertical grid, vertical sweep, what are we talking about here?
It's, this is more of a horizontal, I guess, search line.
Okay, nonetheless, this is a search line, and you said that search parties went through here so at least 10 times, if I heard you correctly, correct?
Yes.
In this fashion, in a line, right?
Yes.
To the point where part of that slope there was eroded by so much human activity.
By the time we stopped searching this area. I mean, it was after several years of searching.
Okay. And this picture again was taken during those searches in June 2013, right?
Yes.
Any refuse in that picture?
Not that I can see.
230, please. Are you with me?
Yes,
230 kind of shows the terrain, the search, correct?
yes,
And obviously these people in the photo are moving uphill from left to right, lower corner to right corner, correct?
yes,
So it's possible to ambulate, to move up this slope, correct?
yes, it is.
And as we know from the video, it's possible to go downhill as well, correct?
Yes,
No refuse in that photo, is there?
not that I can see.
231. And we can move on to 233.
Just, do you want me to go to 233 or 231?
233, I apologize for the
Okay.
confusion. That's
Yep.
one of those things where you say, you're confusing me, and it corrects me.
Okay.
What do we see here again?
This is Investigator Dan Patterson and another investigator, searching between the downed trees.
And do you recall what items he found during these searches?
He found, well, there's a difference between him finding and collecting.
What he collected, thank you,
Okay, in this particular,
during this search, when this picture
this
was
whole
taken?
search,
Yes, ma'am.
I don't recall everything he, collected, but he collected a femur, a tibia, a clavicle, earbuds. I believe he's the one that processed all those.
Do you recall him collecting a Miller Lite beer can?
No,
Looking at the photo he took of that Miller Lite beer can, refresh your recollection.
I don't recall a beer can on that date.
Now, you testified that another beer can you found, right?
Yes,
And that was Coors Light, right?
yes,
But you have no recollection. And looking at Mr. Patterson's photograph wouldn't refresh your recollection to a Miller Lite beer can being found in this area.
no,
And we can take down 233. You testified about People's Exhibit 225. That was the video, correct?
yes,
And what you testified is that it was possible to walk down from Middle Mountain Road to this kind of search area, right?
yes,
And it's possible to walk down there because there's a trail there, correct?
yes,
And that's the Bear Creek Trail, correct?
yes,
And there's also an ATV track there as well, correct?
yes.
And if the people would be kind enough to publish 224, prosecution 224. Scroll up. Scroll so the picture goes up. Thank you. You testified on direct that this area denoted by the text box as Recovery Site 1, and this area in general, gets a fair amount of use, correct?
Yes.
And you said that this area gets used by hikers,
Yes,
climbers,
yes,
folks riding OHVs,
yes,
ATVs, and the like?
yes.
Okay. And I believe you said the area where the technical climbers, the folks using harnesses and ropes, is in this area here where the topography gets pretty steep, right? And we know that because the lines are so close together, correct?
I believe that it's,
Here, I'm going to give you the space you need to do that.
more this, down this way than there, I believe.
Safe to say that area is popular with many different kinds of folks who recreate there.
Yes,
And I thank the people for being patient with me. Could we publish 234 again. And that's one of the bones you found, correct?
Yes,
And this is an item that you collected, checked into evidence, correct?
yes,
And explain to the jury what that process is. It's like a two-part process generally. There's a collection and checking into evidence, correct?
yes.
Describe that for us.
Okay. So whenever we would find evidence, we wouldn't touch it, take a picture of it, GPS the coordinates, write that. What I typically did was write it on the evidence bag, so I knew that item came from that GPS point, and put it in the evidence bag, folded it up, put it in our backpack, and then when we got back to the office, it was taken into the evidence room, where we would then process it with photographs and measurements, and then they get sealed and actually logged into evidence.
Okay. And we can take down 234. You testified on direct that other bones, non-human bones, were discovered and to a certain extent collected as well, correct?
Yes,
And as you said, you're not an osteo or an archaeologist or an anthropologist. You're not a bone expert.
correct.
So in an abundance of caution, when you saw a bone, that was an item of interest, correct?
Yes,
And you saw a lot of animal remains in this area, correct?
yes.
Do you recall seeing any full skeletons or pelvis or backbones of animals?
Yes,
And did you make sure that those full skeletons were documented and photographed?
if they were obviously animal, no.
And one of the things you talked about on direct was the decision to take these items, the human bones, the remains, and take them to Durango stemmed in part upon concerns you had about leaving them there, correct?
Correct.
And safe to say, for the human bones, the remains that you found, they obviously weren't left in their place and subject to any sort of forensic excavation, correct?
Correct.
And that was because, as you explained on direct, you were afraid that something might happen to these remains if they were left in place, correct?
Correct, and we didn't know if we had human remains or animal remains.
So there wasn't a philosophy of if we see something that looks like human remains, let's play it safe, let's mark it, let's GPS it, and let's do a forensic excavation and see what we got here. That was not the philosophy.
That's correct.
The philosophy was, if it's a close call, get it out of here, get it to Durango, and then see what it is.
Yes,
But another concern that you articulated on direct was fear that something would happen to these remains if you left them there overnight.
yes,
And as you testified on direct, this was a large search and rescue effort, correct?
yes,
Coordinating several different branches of law enforcement and search and rescue, correct?
yes,
And I think you even testified on direct, you had somewhere between 50 and 60 people up there.
yes,
And you don't think the sheriff's department, while investigating the disappearance of Dylan Redwine, had the ability to secure that area and leave someone there to watch that area to make sure nothing happened to those remains?
I'm sure we had the ability to,
And it was just a decision not to do so.
yes.
And you testified on direct that during some of these searches, some anthropology students attended as well, correct?
Yes,
But they did not attend the June 2013 searches, according to your direct testimony, right?
not that I remember. I think they came in after, but I could be wrong.
During the searches of this part of Middle Mountain, human remains found in animal scat were discovered, correct?
Yes,
And the obvious, even lay conclusion there would be that some of these remains were fully consumed by animals.
yes.
I'd ask the people to publish what's already been admitted, 505, please. And you remember testifying about this exhibit on direct, correct?
Yes,
And to reorient everyone, the white line kind of zigzags across the top of the photo. That's Middle Mountain Road, correct?
yes,
Now, I'm going to try it from this angle and block anyone's view, please. And the place where the bright yellow sign that motorists are supposed to see is right here, correct?
yes,
And the popular area with hikers, campers, climbers, recreationalists is in this purple area as well, correct?
yes,
And you testified, pardon me, you've testified quite a bit about the geography of everything in this picture, correct?
yes,
And you even testified that this area here, where my hand is going down the middle of a purple shape, that's pretty steep, correct?
yes,
And that the area right beneath the recovery site is pretty steep, correct?
yes,
And this steepness kind of continues up this drainage all the way to another point on Middle Mountain Road, correct?
yes,
And it appears that that portion of Middle Mountain Road is a lot closer to the steep drainage than this part, Middle Mountain Road. Do you agree with that?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yeah. We got a steep drainage right here. Would you agree with that?
Yes,
And Middle Mountain Road is close to it up here at the top, correct?
yes,
And it's closer, the road is closer to this steep drainage here than it is here in the purple dot, right? Or in the purple blob.
yes,
Now, looking at the geography here, this area to the right, to the viewer's right of the purple is less steep than the drainage, correct?
yes,
506. Same area, different exhibit, correct?
I'm sorry, excuse me?
Same area, different exhibit, correct?
Yes,
And again, you testified that this is another purple area that got searched, right?
yes,
And there's a cliff band to the viewer's right of that, correct?
yes,
And then further to the right of that cliff band, the geography is not as steep, correct?
where do you feel like it's not as steep?
To the right, purple area, drainage, cliff band, slope with trees. You would agree this area here on the far right is not as steep as these sheer cliffs.
That's correct, I believe.
If the people would be kind enough to publish exhibit, 320. To the best of your knowledge, those were the kicker earbuds that were seized during these searches on Middle Mountain, correct?
Yes,
And you gave your lay opinion about distances of what, or lengths of what we're looking at in this picture, correct?
correct,
And you would agree with me, there's no ruler, metric, or standard in that, correct?
correct.
And we can take that down. If the people would be kind enough to publish 239, please. You recall that as being the scapula that was found at a later date, later than June 2013, correct?
Yes,
And this remain was found at least some period of time after the other long bones were found. And by long bones, I mean the femurs and tibia and stuff like that.
correct.
What, if any, effort was made to measure the distance between this item and the items that were found back in June?
We did Google map it between the GPS points.
Was there any effort to do that on scene?
Not at that time.
And your testimony today is that these remains were in roughly the same area as the other ones, correct?
Roughly.
Roughly means different things to different people. Could you unpack that for us?
In the same area, but not in the cluster of the others, I guess.
And we can take that one down. You testified yesterday about some other investigation you did in this case. One of those was seeking out information for what you described as a tower dump, correct?
Yes,
And describe for the jury briefly what a tower dump is.
a tower dump collects data from cell phones that are in an area at a particular time that hit off the tower.
And your initial effort to secure that data was unsuccessful, correct?
One of the towers, I believe, was unsuccessful at first.
And what I mean more specifically is the paperwork you filled out to get that tower dump, to get that data, to get that information, you put the wrong company's name on the request for the warrant, correct?
Yes,
You also testified briefly yesterday about your efforts to obtain a pen register for Mr. Mark Redwine's phone, correct?
yes,
And you had to fill out paperwork to secure that data as well, correct?
yes,
And you filled out that paperwork incorrectly as well the first time you tried, right?
I don't believe I did.
You don't recall requesting a pen register for 6 months as opposed to 60 days?
No,
Would looking at your supplemental report 501 help you remember if that was in fact the case?
yes.
Do you have any of your reports up there?
No, I didn't bring them.
Approaching with Discovery 635.
Which supplement number is that?
501.
Thank you.
Okay.
Having reviewed the report that you authored, Supplemental 501, do you recall seeking a pen register for a period of 6 months, but you could only request one for 60 days, and therefore your request was rejected?
That actually, I didn't write that PIN register request. That was another investigator. I had been working with Agent Iker on the previous PIN registers, so he reached out to me directly, and then I filled it out correctly.
Was it Agent Iker who got it wrong, or someone at the
No,
Laplata
a
County?
different investigator that doesn't work here anymore.
At Laplata County.
Yes.
Permission to retrieve that, Judge.
Yes.
As part of your investigation in this case, you made multiple trips and had multiple contacts with Mr. Mark Redwine at his home, correct?
Yes.
And on one of those contacts, was on July 16th, 2013, correct?
Probably.
And that was the day that he provided you with a fishing pole, correct?
Okay. Yes, I recall that.
You recall, he provided you voluntarily with the fishing pole, correct?
Yes.
Didn't have to serve a warrant for the fishing pole, he just gave it to you.
Yes.
Now, I'd respectfully request the people to publish Prosecution Exhibit 220. Remember that one being the blurry
Yes.
map of the area?
Yes.
And safe to say, we can see in this map Vallecito Reservoir, Vallecito, Durango, McDonald's and Durango, and Bayfield, correct?
Yes.
Now, as part of your investigation in this matter, you and Investigator Cowing took a drive on November 19th, 2013, correct?
Yes.
And what you wanted to do was gain information, do research on drive times between different destinations of import, of evidentiary value in this case, correct?
Yes.
And you wanted to determine drive times between, say, Mark Redwine's house and United Pipeline?
Yes, we recreated the trip he said that he took that day,
Right.
a year later.
And a year later, on the same date a year later, because it was November 19th, 2013, correct?
Correct.
And that's part of your due diligence to see if Mr. Mark Redwine's timeline jives with the actual drive times between these destinations, correct?
Yes.
And when you and Investigator Cowing did this, and you don't have your supplemental 580 in front of you, do you? If you don't remember
I don't,
dates
I
and
apologize.
times and distances, you may have to refresh. Permission to approach.
Yes.
Approaching with Golbright supplemental 580, that's 751 through 755. And I'm going to lay this down upside down in front of you, and if I ask a question and you don't remember, let us know you're flipping it over to refresh your recollection, okay?
Okay.
Now, when you were doing your due diligence to Mr. Mark Redwine's timeline, you and Investigator Cowing were in a motor vehicle, correct?
Yes,
And you left Mr. Mark Redwine's residence at about 7:31, right? If your report said that, would that be accurate?
yes,
And the idea here initially was to drive to Durango, correct?
yes,
And you took County Road 240 to Durango, correct?
yes,
And we also know that locally as Florida Road, correct?
yes,
And after leaving Mr. Mark Redwine's residence at 7:31, you arrived at United Pipe in Bodo Park at 8:23, correct?
yes,
And for those who don't know or don't remember, when we look at People's 220 here, Mr. Mark Redwine's house is noted up there on the short yellow squiggly line, correct?
yes,
And 240, AKA Florida Road, winds its way through the hills into Durango this way, correct?
yes, that's correct.
And Bodo Park, where you know United Pipe was at the time, probably located off the frame or at the very far right portion of Durango here, correct?
I would agree with that.
You arrived at United Pipe at 8:23. You left United Pipe at 8:42, correct?
Yes,
And it's 6 minutes later, you arrive at South City Market as part of your due diligence, correct?
yes,
And from South City Market, safe to say you stayed there for a while as part of your efforts to recreate Mr. Mark Redwine's timeline?
yes,
And then after you and Investigator Cowing determined you had waited there long enough, you drove to Walmart, correct?
yes,
And you arrived at Walmart at 10:30, correct?
yes,
And when you went to the Walmart, you mean the Walmart here in Durango, Colorado on Camino Royale, right?
yes,
And that's probably pretty blurry in People's 220. I won't try to point it out. Arrive at Walmart at 10:30. You and Investigator Cowing left Walmart at 10:41, correct?
yes,
And then the next part of your due diligence was to drive between the Walmart and what's known as the Mini Merc in Bayfield, correct?
yes,
And after leaving Walmart at 10:41, you arrived at the Mini Merc. That's basically like a gas station, 7-Eleven, correct?
yes.
Right there on 160.
Yeah, off of a frontage road, but yes,
Yeah, right there in Bayfield, correct?
yes,
To recreate that part of the journey, that's just basically a straight shot down 160 from right to left, correct?
yes,
With the Mini Merc, 7-Eleven-ish sort of gas station being right in this Bayfield area. Obviously, we're too zoomed out to actually see that place here, correct?
yes. It's not right there at that intersection, but it's in that,
It's in that area, right?
Yes,
There's
yes.
a bunch of gas stations.
yeah, a couple, yeah.
You and Investigator Cowing remained at that gas station, Mini Merc, for about 3 minutes and left at 11:05, correct?
Yes,
And then you arrived back at Mr. Mark Redwine's house at 11:39, correct?
yes,
And you made a notation that during that last portion of the drive, which goes straight up from Bayfield towards Vallecito. You ran into some road construction that probably slowed you down a little bit, correct?
Yes.
And then, as part of your due diligence, you didn't drive again to try and see what this timeline was about for a couple more hours, right?
I'd have to refer to my report if we did it again. I thought we only did it once.
Just getting back to Mr. Redwine's house wasn't the end of your due diligence on this, correct? You drove to other places that day on November 19th.
Okay, yes,
And you drove away from Mr. Redwine's house and arrived at Tristan Reeves' house at 3:30, correct?
yes,
And then you left Tristan's house for Dylan Redwine's friend's house, Fernando Stubbs, correct?
yes,
You left Tristan's at 3:40, correct?
yes,
You arrived at Fernando's at 3 minutes after 4.
yes,
And then eventually you drove to the Bayfield Marshal's office, correct?
yes,
And you arrived there at 4:15, correct?
yes.
Safe to say, based upon the drive you and the investigator took that day, November 19th, 2013, the timeline that Mr. Mark Redwine provided you checked out as far as drive times and distances, correct?
It was pretty close, yes.
Pretty close. You testified that you followed over 900 tips in this case, correct?
Me personally?
That the sheriff's department.
Yes.
And you yourself followed a lot of those tips, right?
Yeah, I did my fair share.
You did your fair share. And some of those included tips or statements or claims from psychics, mediums, people who said they had visions, right?
Yes,
And the philosophy was, if we get a tip, no matter where it's coming from and where the information purports to come from, we're going to follow up on it. Safe to say?
well, that, and then there's also, I have experience with psychics, or people who claim to be psychics actually have intimate knowledge of a crime, and then they portray themselves as a psychic to either gain reward money or clear a guilty conscience. So I didn't want to undervalue any of the tips.
Because it's two things. One, as you said, you're going to do everything you can. And two, one of these people might actually have real knowledge, but they're not saying where the knowledge came from.
Yeah, that they're psychic.
Now, one of the reports you got was that Mr. Mike Hall saw Mark Redwine driving up Middle Mountain Road, correct?
He saw Mark Redwine driving down Middle Mountain Road.
Correct. And your understanding was that that was on April 22nd, 2013, correct?
I believe so.
But it turned out you got that date wrong, had to write a correction, and that was actually on April 23rd, correct?
Okay. Yes, I recall
And you made a
that.
note of that you made that mistake.
I recall that.
And you were aware that cameras were placed on Middle Mountain Road as well, correct?
Yes.
Middle Mountain, and those cameras were placed there to see if Mr. Mark Redwine was driving up and down Middle Mountain Road for any reason, right?
Yes, and other people, I guess, I suppose.
But you were looking, or those cameras were set up for, to see if specifically Mr. Mark Redwine was traveling that road, correct?
I didn't really have much part of the cameras on the road. I was aware that they were put up there, but I don't really know even where they were put.
And those cameras didn't return anything of evidentiary value, correct?
Not that I recall. I don't think the cameras were up there yet, and at that time frame.
What time frame?
The April 23rd,
Right. They came in after that, correct?
yes.
Now, you were party to a search of Mr. Mark Redwine's truck on March 20th, 2014, correct?
Yes,
And part of that search included trying to collect air from that truck, correct?
yes.
Objection, Judge, we're beyond the scope at this point. Also calls for expert testimony.
Well, the collecting air, I don't think calls for expert testimony, depending how far it goes with that.
The results do, though.
I understand that.
Thank you.
So, Mr. Bogan, in terms of the scope?
The pictures of the truck that the people introduced flow from the same search.
All right, go ahead.
And the idea of this search was to seal the Dodge truck, correct?
Yes,
And then try and vacuum air out of that truck, correct?
yes,
Put that air into tubes,
yes,
and then have another expert determine if that air contained chemicals in it consistent with the smell of cadavers, correct?
human decom,
Human decomp, right?
yes,
Okay. And you did that process, right?
yes,
Suck the air out of the truck, put it in tubes, send it off to be analyzed, right?
yes,
On February 14th of 2014, you were party to the search of Mr. Redwine's septic tank, correct?
yes,
And you secured the means and the clearance to have a local plumber pump all the stuff out of the septic tank, correct?
it was a plumber, he like pumps septic tanks for a living.
Right. And that search returns nothing of evidentiary value, correct?
Correct,
Now, were you party to the search that took place on November 29th, 2012?
was that the one on 240, AKA Florida?
I'm referring to the search, and thank you for asking me to clarify. I'm referring to the search of Mr. Mark Redwine's house on November
Oh.
29th.
No, I was not.
Okay. You were party to, as you testified, to another search on August 14th of Mr. Redwine's house, correct?
Yes,
And it was at that time that several items were seized from his house during that search, correct?
yes,
And again, this search is happening August 14th, 2013, correct?
yes,
Almost a year after Dylan has gone missing and after his remains have been found, correct? August 14th,
Yes,
2013. And one of the items that you found outside the house on August 14th, 2013 was a black sock, correct?
yes,
Permission to approach with what's been previously marked as defendants 1884.
Yes.
Is defense 1884 an accurate representation of where that item was found and what it looked like when you discovered it?
yes,
And as you testified on direct, you had been there previously that month, August 2013, with some dog handlers, yes or no?
yes.
And do you have any recollection of any of the dog handlers saying that the dogs
No, not gonna let you do that.
were good dogs?
What? No, we're not,
Fair enough.
you're as far as you can go with that. The handlers that are gonna testify will testify.
To the best of your recollection, can you recite to the jury how many times Mr. Redwine's house was searched?
Give me just a minute. I'm gonna think in my
By all
in my
means,
head.
by all means.
And while she's thinking, did you want 1884 admitted or not?
I would move to admit 1884, thank you.
Mr. Champagne?
Well, at this point, I'd object on grounds of relevance, Your Honor. But it's a fair and accurate picture. I don't dispute that. I just don't know what it's relevant to.
Well, maybe we'll find out.
Okay.
I'll admit it.
Are you wanting to know with, search warrants or search warrants and consent?
Search warrants and consent, your best recollection.
Okay. And, are you wanting to know when we just went inside or including
Inside.
the septic?
Inside, and including the septic.
I'd say approximately 6.
6 searches of his house, about 3 searches of his cars, of his trucks, correct?
Once, I think 2 searches of the GMC and 3 of the Dodge.
And as you testified, you were present for the search on August 14th, 2013, correct?
Yes,
And permission to approach with what's been previously marked as Defendant's Exhibit 1875.
Yes.
Wait, actually, strike that. My apologies. 1877. Without getting to the details of what 1877 depicts, what is it? Photograph, drawing, diagram?
it's a diagram.
And does it accurately portray where furniture was placed in Mr. Mark Redwine's house on August 14th, 2013, when you conducted that search?
Yes,
Move to admit 1877.
Any objection?
Fair enough.
Admitted.
And we may publish that through another witness at another time. Permission motion to approach with defense previously marked 1879.
Yes.
And without getting into the details, is 1879 a diagram, photograph? What is it?
It's a photograph.
And does that photograph, 1879, accurately depict how furniture was placed, what the living room looked like when you searched Mr. Redwine's house on August 14th, 2013?
Yes.
And we'll have to publish that through probably another witness.
Did you want it admitted?
Yes, please, both exhibits, Judge.
All right, so which other one did, maybe I missed something. So 1879, and what was the other one?
1878.
1877.
1877, thank you.
Well, please don't do that because it really screws up everything.
Understood.
77's already in.
Okay.
1879 is admitted unless you have an objection.
No objection, Your Honor.
We clear to go forward, Judge?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. And you can take down 220, thanks. You testified on direct about how in November 2015 you found a skull.
Yes.
And for the purposes of my questioning, I'm going to use the word cranium, or you use skull, if that's okay. You understand?
Yes.
And it's your understanding, based upon your investigation and information that affected how you conducted searches on Middle Mountain, that the cranium was found by Daniel and Lee Foster on November 1st, 2015, correct?
Yes.
And you know from your involvement in this case, that's roughly almost 3 years after Dylan went missing, correct?
Correct.
And you know from your investigation in this case that the Fosters reported that to Laplata County Sheriff's Department, and you acted on that pretty much the next day, correct?
Yes.
Because as you testified, it was fall,
Yes.
weather was coming in, correct?
Yes.
You wanted to get this done, so you go up there on the 2nd, correct?
Yes.
And that's just you and Lee, as far as civilians go, correct? Daniel did not accompany that first time.
That's correct. He did not come until the next day.
And it sounded like from direct, you spent the balance of November 2nd looking for this cranium in Runlet Park, correct?
Yes.
I'd ask the people to publish 505 if I'm thinking of the right one. That's the wrong one. Give me one moment. Yeah. 514. Thank you, counsel. Thank you very much. Yes. November 2015, you take up the search based upon the information you get from the Fosters in this area that's labeled and denoted by kind of this wide open area here as Runlet Park, correct?
Yes.
And what we know about Runlet Park is that Middle Mountain Road doesn't end there, but actually goes kind of across the top of it and then keeps on going all the way to Tuckerville, correct?
Yes.
And Runlet Park is characterized as kind of a open grassy area, correct?
Yes. Yes.
Although there are some stands of trees in the area, correct?
Yes.
And it's actually bordered by forest, correct?
Yes.
And That's because when you get up to this elevation, as you know from living around here, you get less and less trees.
Right, less oxygen.
And Runlet Park is obviously further up the road from where the gate on Middle Mountain Road is, correct?
Yes,
And it's further up the road from the first recovery or dump site, correct?
correct.
And in People's 514, we can't even see Mr. Mark Redwine's house here, correct?
No.
Sounds like you spent the balance of November 2nd, 2015 in Runlet Park looking for this cranium, correct?
Yes,
And your efforts were unsuccessful, so you returned the next day, right?
yes,
And when you returned the next day, Lieutenant Azell was there, correct?
yes,
And Investigator Gabbard, he had an ATV, correct?
yes.
And Investigator Cowing, correct?
No, Investigator Cowling didn't go the second day.
And that day, you're, as you've already testified, with Daniel and Lee as well, correct?
Yes,
And as you testified on direct, day 2 of looking for this very important piece of evidence, and it's more important than that too, you would agree, right? It's not just evidence.
absolutely.
You started to get frustrated, right?
Yes,
And you made your frustration apparent to those around you because you wanted to find this if it was up there, right?
I don't know if I made it apparent to people around me.
Okay. And it's your testimony that after looking around Runlet Park, following rivulets, fingers of drainages through that area, at a certain point you started to move from one area to a new area you hadn't looked at, right?
Right.
And Daniel was walking behind you and Lee. Did I hear that correctly?
Well, Lee and I walked over and found another fingerling or whatever you called it. And
how about we just agree to call it a little tiny, tiny stream of water?
okay, how about that as a stream? So, and it was an area we hadn't been in the previous day. So I asked her, does this look familiar to you? And she said, maybe, and said she wanted Daniel to come look. And so then she called for Daniel, he walked over.
And it's your testimony today that sometime during this, while Daniel's walking over, he finds this, holds it up and yells, skull.
Yes,
And your reaction to that sounded like it was lightning quick, correct?
yes,
And you make a move towards Daniel, hop over the little tiny, tiny, tiny creek, take the cranium from him, put it back on the ground.
I set it on the ground.
Set it on the ground. Because you understand the import of this, and you want to be fragile with it, or you want to treat it as a fragile item.
Yes,
And based upon your training and expertise and living in the world we live in, it was apparent to you almost immediately that this was probably a human skull, correct?
yes,
And yourself, Lieutenant Azell, Investigator Gabbard, you all have radio communications and ability to call stuff in from there, correct?
yes, but I believe most everyone was within earshot.
Right. But if you wanted to call someone in Durango or radio someone from Durango, you had the capability to do that, right?
I don't know if we had radios on us. We had cell phones.
Was upon finding this item that based upon your training experience and looking at, you believed was a human skull, did you make any effort to contact the local coroner?
Not on the mountain.
Did you make any effort to contact the local coroner before the cranium was removed from Runlet Park?
No. I highly doubt there was cell phone service down that far.
was any effort made to preserve that scene and leave the cranium where it was originally found?
No, like I said, there was a storm coming in, and it looked like it was going to dump a lot of snow. We couldn't leave somebody up there.
You couldn't leave a person up there?
No.
Laplata County Sheriff's Department would not have been able to?
They wouldn't have been able to get back out without snowmobiles, I'm assuming. But no.
You know how much snow fell the next day?
I don't.
You know if any snow fell the next day in Runlet Park?
I know it started snowing before we got off the mountain.
But you don't know what the accumulation was?
No.
And there wasn't a winter storm warning at that time, to your knowledge?
I don't remember.
Safe to say, no effort was made to do a forensic excavation of that area before the cranium was removed, correct?
Correct.
So initially, the cranium gets collected, put in an evidence bag, and it was Lieutenant Ezell who took possession of it initially that day, correct?
Yes.
And he was the one who transported it to Durango, correct?
Yes.
And I think you testified to this on direct, but after the cranium was found, further searching of that area was conducted by the party, correct?
After the skull?
Yes, ma'am.
No, we had to leave.
There was no other looking around that?
We might have looked in the immediate area briefly, but then we needed to leave.
Permission to approach with what's been previously marked as defendants 1893.
Yes.
Without testifying to the details, can you tell us what defendants 1893 is? Without getting into the details, is it a photograph, a diagram, what is it?
It's a photograph.
Okay. And does it accurately depict another item that was found that date, November 3rd, 2015 in Runlet Park?
Yes.
Move to admit defendants 1893.
Mr. Champagne? No objection, Your Honor. It's admitted.
And we may publish it another time, another witness, but defendants 1893, that portrays other animal bones that were found up there, correct?
Yes.
And as you testified on direct, you didn't find any other items up there in Runlet Park on November 3rd, 2015, correct?
Correct.
Turning back to when you saw the cranium with Lee Foster for the first time, you turned to her and you said, "I can't wait to see his face when I tell him about this," correct?
I don't recall that.
You don't recall that?
Whose face?
I don't know, you tell me.
I didn't say that.
Now, to the best of your knowledge, it was Lieutenant Ezell that took the cranium to Mercy Medical in Durango for further investigation, correct?
Yes.
And then at another later date, you took the cranium to Fort Lewis College campus to have another expert look at it, correct?
It was, Dr. Mulhern,
Right.
but she also responded to,
You've answered my question.
okay.
And can you again explain to the jury what the process is for logging in, as Mr. Champagne characterized it, as checking in a piece of evidence at the Sheriff's Department?
Photographing it, GPSing it, collecting it. Depends if, further processing needs to be done, but then enter it into evidence.
And safe to say, this item, the cranium, it was put in protective packaging, correct?
I'm sure it was.
And it was sealed in that protective packaging, correct? With tape.
Yes.
And then the standard practice for any piece of evidence at Laplata County Sheriff's Department is if an item is in protective packaging, gets sealed, correct?
Yes.
And then if anyone in law enforcement wants to have access to that piece of evidence, they have to cut that seal, take out the item, correct?
Yes.
And then when they return that item, they put it back in the protective packaging, correct?
Yes.
And then they sign and date the package saying when they did that, correct?
Yes.
And that's to make sure that items of evidence are always accounted for, correct?
Yes.
And on November 6th, you went to the evidence room at La Plata County Sheriff to get the cranium, correct?
I don't know if it had been placed into evidence yet or not. I can't remember.
Do you recall taking the cranium to Dr. Mulhorn on November 6th?
Yes.
And that was so she could do an analysis, and then you returned it, correct?
Yes.
But when you did that, you didn't make note of you taking it out of its protective packaging and putting it back in and putting the date and your signature on that package, correct?
I don't think it had been sealed yet.
Permission to approach with defendants 1901 and 1902.
Yes.
Do you recognize 1901 and 1902?
Yes.
And are they fair and accurate representations of what they purport to be, AKA photographs of packaging?
Yes.
Move to admit 1901, 1902.
Objection. They're admitted.
Ask the court to called HDMI. Permission to publish 1901.
Yes, go ahead.
Deputy, is that the packaging that the cranium was initially in after it was collected?
I don't know what it was packaged in originally. I'm assuming this is the original packaging, but I don't know.
And permission to move to the screen, Judge?
Yes.
Are you assuming that it's the packaging, pardon me, are you assuming it's the packaging the cranium was in because it says fragile human skull with evidence tape across it? Lieutenant Azel's initials are there,
Yes.
and there's a receipt from Mercy Hospital, part number as well.
Okay, it's not really coming clear on the,
You would agree with me that says that though, right?
yeah, I guess so.
I'm zooming in a little bit. Does that help?
I can see the handwriting that it says that, I just can't tell what the sticker says.
And what we know the sticker says
Oh, that sticker.
is 530, correct? To the right of where it says evidence,
Oh, yes,
says a case number, correct?
yes,
And actually, there's an item number there, 529, that's crossed out, correct?
yes,
That's because originally it was given the wrong number and had to be changed to 530, correct?
or it was a mistake just writing it down.
And the date says 11/3/15, correct?
Yes,
Time 1656.
yes,
Well, did I say 1656?
yes,
Says Middle Mountain, 11 miles, correct?
yes,
Human skull, right?
yes,
If we look to the right of that, there's a number of notations, correct?
yes.
And actually, these are better portrayed on 1902, permission to publish.
Yes, go ahead.
And again, to refresh, standard practices when you take an item of evidence out of its packaging, break the seal, take it out, do your investigation with it, denote when you took it out of the packaging, and denote when you put it back in, correct?
Correct.
And if we look at this packaging here for item 530, human skull, there's notes that said it was opened by JCE, who we know is Investigator Heidel, correct?
Yes,
Opened by JCE 11/5/15 for photos by S. Fire, correct?
yes,
Then it says resealed 11/5/15 10:58 by JCE, correct?
yes,
And then the next entry after that is opened by Diane France 11/23/2015, correct?
yes.
There's no entry here for when you took the skull out.
That's because I didn't take, oh, you're talking about when I saw Dr. Mulhern. We don't typically write when we open and close and reseal stuff on the packaging. I bet you if you were to look at the evidence logs through our evidence text, my name would be on it.
Turning your attention to Discovery page 17476, Laplata County Sheriff's Evidence Log. I'd ask you to review this and tell me where it says it was checked out to you on November 6th, 2015.
It's probably on a different, evidence log.
You would agree with me, the top of that document says Laplata County Sheriff's Evidence Log, correct?